Good evening and welcome to Admissions Live. It's the live web show for college admissions professionals. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live Network, a project of EdUniverse Media Incorporated. Welcome to the show. I am your host, Ashley Hennigan, and it is our first show of the year. Tonight I'm joined by David Hawkins, Director of Public Policy and Research at the National Association for College Admission Counseling, and we're going to be talking about and celebrating the 10th anniversary of the State of College Admission Report. Before we start the show, I want to give two big thank yous to the sponsors who are making Admissions Live possible. Admissions Live is sponsored by Welcome to College, who believe it's all in the visit and who have created web and mobile applications to help institutions measure and manage their most critical recruitment tool, the college visit. With over 15,000 ratings on Welcome to College's site, you can check out how prospective students and parents are rating their college visit experiences. Admissions Live is also sponsored by Zinch, who has partnered with the Center for Student Opportunity to provide free professional development opportunities for admissions counselors. Tune in for a free webinar on January 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for First Generation Focus, a webinar dedicated to resources and programs to support first-generation college students as they navigate their college search and selection. You can email outreach@zinch.com or tweet at socialadmission, or you can visit the zinch.com/webinars site to sign up for those. We also just tweeted out some links for viewers who are tuning in live for those sponsor plugs. Tonight, if you are joining us, we encourage you to use the Admissions Live hashtag on Twitter to join the conversation. We'll also be fielding questions for David around the 7:30 mark tonight, so please send those over to us. Again, joining me is the Director of Public Policy and Research at the National Association for College Admission Counseling, or also known as NACAC, David Hawkins. David has his BA and MA in government from the College of William and Mary, one of my favorite colleges. They've been on the show before. He began working at NACAC in 2000, and it's really hard for me to believe that we are so far into the 2000s. When I was reading his bio and he said he's been with NACAC for 13 years, I didn't think that math added up. But we are really happy that he's joining us, and he's got a lot of experience working so closely with this report. David conceived and authored the State of College Admission Report in 2002, and as I mentioned, it's in its 10th anniversary year this year. So without further ado, I do want to bring David onto the show. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Well, thank you, Ashley. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so happy to be doing this show again. It's the second year that we've covered this topic right as the first show of the year, and I think it's so important to share. When I got my hands on the copy of this report, especially this year's anniversary report, I was really, really impressed. I think there had to be some change in layout and how the content was delivered this year, because things were really easy to reference, and some of the topics that you and your co-authors are calling attention to really hit home for me this year. So I'm excited to share it. If folks haven't gotten their hands on this report yet, they should head on over to the NACAC website and download themselves a copy. So you've been such a major part of this report from the very start. Can you start by telling me a little bit about the inspiration for the report, and maybe why you think it's proven to be such a value that it's been a decade in the making?
Well, sure, Ashley. Not many people know NACAC's been collecting data from colleges and universities for a little more than 2 decades, but for a long time, the main avenue for communicating the results was the NACAC Bulletin. And while we do have a healthy readership of the Bulletin, it just doesn't get to the people that we hope to reach, which ultimately are the full profession, plus the public, the media, anybody else who's interested in this field. And So when I took over research here in 2002, I kind of looked at the landscape, and really the only admission report that was being put out in an objective fashion was a survey that took place every 5 years, and it was NACAC was a part of it, but we really didn't contribute all that much. Some of the larger entities in college admission were a part of that. Plus, we didn't survey our counselors. And as anybody who's been to a NACAC conference knows, our counselors have a lot to say and a lot of good things to say. So we decided to institute that survey as part of our annual research schedule. And we felt like, our members deserved a voice. Oftentimes when I'm speaking with reporters, I talk about admissions being kind of like the weddings industry. Everybody goes through it once, maybe more than once, who knows. But the idea is that there's a fresh crop of people coming through this system every year. And we know we can all list the publications and information that fills that vacuum every year, the rankings being one, and there are many, many other products available on the bookshelf. But we felt like the media particularly, but also professionals and students and families deserved to hear the voice directly of the people who actually do this for a living, the people who are most qualified to talk about it, who often don't get to talk about it because the conversation's dominated by discussions in the media and in school and wherever else. So that we felt like then, and we feel like now on the 10th anniversary, that this report gives us an opportunity to serve our members by putting their voices out in public. And we found that the report has gained a lot of visibility. People come to it. The media comes to it just like the weddings industry. They come to it every year and they ask the same questions every year about, is it getting more selective, and is it this, that, and the other. So I think we find ourselves in a position that's similar to admission officers. We go out each year and we tell the story. It might be slightly different from year to year, and we try to make it lively and exciting for folks so that they can get the information that we consider to be pretty unbiased. So that's kind of in a nutshell, the history of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Great. And I have to agree that you are hitting your target audience. And I know that there's been some major facelifts to this report this year that has really helped me. So kudos to your graphic designer, the layout work that they did this year. I want to talk a little bit about what we covered last year and, just reflect on the work that was done in 2012 and get your reaction to progress that we might have made. Last year on this show, your colleague, Dawn Frazier, identified the biggest challenges in our profession to be, one, an image problem, specifically the value of higher education and the high costs associated with it, and two, a growing population of historically underrepresented students, and whether or not the system we've built will be able to accommodate them. So he really called out those two big challenges for the industry in 2012. So looking back and looking forward, what are your thoughts on those challenges? Have we made any progress?
Wow, that's those are big questions.
Yeah.
I hope the answer is yes,
Me
but it's
too.
a qualified yes. I'd have to agree with Don. Our system, such as it is, which isn't really a system, but our network of thousands of institutions have moved slowly in some cases. Just last week, the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education released its Knocking at the College Door report. And the Department of Education released their projections as well. And as we've monitored them in our report, I think we've known as a country for a long time that our demographics were going to change. These kids weren't born yesterday. They were born 17, 18 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So I think, perhaps as institutions, we probably need to move faster. In changing our approach to not only to enrolling students, but in the whole recruitment process. Now, some of the issues that that cause us to see some of the trends that we see in state of college admission, both in 2012 and again, or sorry, in 2011 and again in 2012, are systemic, and they are often, I think, the result of public policies that haven't kept pace with, first of all, reality, but second of all, demand. The notion that we had earlier in the last century committed to public education as a public good was a very powerful idea. But somehow in the late 20th century and continuing on up through this decade, we've, I think, lost sight of that. So in addition to, to the smaller part that institutions can play through recruitment, through relationship building with high schools and students, clearly we have to advocate on behalf of students and education as a whole. And certainly NACAC does that, but a whole range of other organizations do as well. So I think that, I would agree with Don that we have major challenges ahead of us. And I don't know how much or how little admission affects those major challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with the image challenge that we have, so much of that now is tied in with cost and the student debt in the media, and their favorite question, that is college worth it question, that's in the newspaper at least once a week. So that combination, I think, with cost and our ability to communicate not just about the admissions process, but about the financial aid processes too, is something that I noted was highlighted in the report. So again, you're kind of hitting home on some of those key areas and the highlights in the report that do provide real feedback from school counselors and admissions counselors, and we'll get into that a little bit more, talking about counseling students on student loans and those kinds of things should be part of the admissions counselors' core competencies that maybe weren't there in the last decade. So I want to, before we get into specifics of the report, I do want to take kind of a bird's eye view of what is in this thing. I've got it right here. I've got nice little tabs on what was really interesting to me and what I need to follow up on. But if we could just go over and highlight some of the things that I found interesting in each chapter, and I'd love to hear some of your reactions on the findings. So in the first chapter of the report, you cover high school graduation and college enrollment, and it's a lot of the demographic shifts and things that are taking place with high school age students. So it seems like graduation rates are stabilizing now. We saw spikes in different areas of the country, but overall it's stabilizing. Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, there is a fire department next door, and I don't know if anyone can hear that, but it's causing me not to be able to hear the last part of what you said. However, looking at that first chapter, I always start with what I call the roller coaster, and that's a graph in the first chapter that just follows the population of students that are headed to college. And we see that the fluctuations in enrollment, or at least in sort of direct movement from high school to college, follow those pretty closely. However, the fact that more students are enrolling is something that is wrapping up more than just our traditional demographic. And you see those gaps that you talked about earlier. And that's something that I think we look at here at NACAC as being one of those things we can help change. Like you said, with the image issue, a lot of what I think we do is build relationships. And I think most colleges understand where they get most of their students from already. It's probably going to be turning over those rocks, that people haven't looked at in the past, whether they're high schools that you just didn't really visit as much, whether they're community-based organizations or other avenues for reaching students. I think ultimately that's where that first chapter kind of points us, where we see the overall fluctuations, we still see gaps, and sort of that's sort of what we try to set the context for the rest of the report by sort of letting people know that there is an environment to this.
Right.
There are things, external considerations that affect the way we work.
Absolutely. And, from a university, a regionally, positioned university in the Northeast, I have been told about the decline in our population and how that is, going to be affecting our institution and other regional institutions. So, the report gives you such a better understanding outside of what's happening just regionally, and what's happening across the nation, and how you might change strategy to hit those gap areas. So that is really helpful. And the next chapter is moving on into college applications. And this is where you really find out a lot about what we're doing behind our desks, which I'm sure is great information for you being outside of the institution space. And it looks, well, I think technology has had a huge impact in the past decade on the sheer number of college applications that institutions are receiving, and the ability for students to apply to many colleges certainly been a result of technology, most notably the Common Application. So we're seeing that spike in number of applications across the board, but that has a lot of kind of dramatic effects on other areas of enrollment, and specifically being able to predict what that spike means. So can you highlight for us, in generalities, what that spike looks like?
Yeah, that's there are very few concrete findings that we ever try to draw from this data, because it is a big and diverse field. But one that we feel pretty confident about is precisely what you said, which is the very direct correspondence. I wouldn't say correlation because we haven't tested it, being a researcher, but there is a very observable trend between the rise in the percentage of online applications that colleges receive. And that mirrors very closely the development of software, working inside the industry, et cetera, and just the development of the internet overall. But the number of applications has increased exponentially compared to the increase in population. And what that causes is a bit of mayhem in the admission office writ large, the national sort of admission office view. Because while we've seen rising applications, we've also seen declining selectivity rates, which is, that's logical, right? So far we're on track. Mm-hmm. But then we also see an increasing number of acceptances going out overall. So, you're left to think, well, wait a minute, if colleges are sending out, an appreciably larger number of acceptance letters, mm-hmm. Why is the selectivity rate going down? Well, that speaks to the magnitude of the inflation that's happened in applications. Yeah, and that has led to the final sort of observable trend, and that is the pronounced decline in yield rates for colleges. Mm-hmm. And that, when we look at the data by institution on that, which we don't reflect as much in the report, though we do give some numbers in one of our figures about categories of institution by selectivity. When we look at the national data, we see that declining yield problem is a problem from the very most selective colleges all the way down to colleges that might accept 70, 80, 90% of their applicants. Mm-hmm. So it's not something that is only a lot of our trends really apply to one sector or another or one segment or another of the colleges. This one really hits everybody, and that's what makes us feel like this is probably the defining trend of the last decade.
And so one thing that came to mind while you were mentioning increased number of acceptance going out, do you have any sense of whether institutions have kind of jumped on board with that growth and gone after a growth model themselves? Thinking of tuition-driven business models of these institutions, and the ability to kind of grow during this time. Is that something that is out in a totally different area, or is that something that might have been a result of, an easier way to apply increased communication amongst, college admissions offices and the ability to get more people in the door?
Well, I think ultimately, while we have seen some growth from an enrollment standpoint at many institutions, and therefore I can probably say with some confidence that there has been capacity growth. It doesn't come close to the growth in applications or the decline in yield. So I think primarily what that is, and that being the increasing number of acceptance letters being sent out, is simply a fact of life that colleges, in order to get the same number of students in the fall, they have to actually send out more applications. I keep getting my terms mixed up. In order to get the right number of students for the fall, they have to send out more acceptance letters. And in order for their selectivity rates not to either plummet or rise precipitously in a single year, they also have to take in more applications. And I've explained on many occasions that phenomenon is rooted in many things, one of which is perhaps an institution's desire to be selective, and that desire is often fueled and perpetuated by trustees and states and alumni and current students, and you name it. Right. There are also external drivers of that equation, like the rankings and others who put some value in selectivity as some sort of a measure of quality. So when you put that all together, colleges are working. I think many colleges are working just as hard to keep their numbers where they're supposed to be, and I use the sort of the air quotes around "supposed to be."
Right.
And I think that's maybe a long-winded way of answering that question. It's not. I don't think it's so much about capacity, although some of it is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that section of the report does touch on technology being a big influencer, not just in applications, but enhanced technologies that colleges are using, virtual tours and chats and other kinds of social media. So I know a lot of viewers have interest in that area. Chapter 2 is for you. Chapter 3 goes into the admissions practices, and a few things that really stood out for me. Waitlists have been continuing for the past several years to be kind of an issue, more of a problem for us. So I'm curious for your comment on waitlists and what those increased numbers in waitlists have meant for the industry as a whole, and how that's been impacting students. We kind of, I think, make these decisions in our own silos and don't think about how they affect everything else, but they certainly do. And then the other, we'll use the air quotes again, the on the spot and the priority applications that now a quarter of colleges are using. Those practices too, I would say all of those practices, I think, have some pretty widespread effects on what's happening in search and college selection as a whole. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on those things.
Yeah, well, the wait list and early decision, early action information is all interesting. I see it as sort of the tail end of the discussion we just had about population and about applications and trying to manage all of this. Wait lists as a yield strategy have become increasingly deployed by institutions to try to mitigate this slide in yield rates. I mean, it really is as simple as that.
Right. Now,
the ramifications are obviously more complicated, and I think that's where when large numbers of students are being put on wait lists, I think we risk maybe frustrating people even further because you're dragging the process out. Yep.
Oops, it looks like we might have frozen a bit.
Oh, okay. Are we back now?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, we're back.
So, I think maybe we've even created a somewhat of an echo or a carbon copy of the admission process that just happens later on in the year for this wait list thing. So I think that's something to think about. And then you know what? I've just blanked on the other part. The on-the-spot applications. Yeah, I mean, now again, that to me is the other end, the more of the front end of the issue. This issue we've talked about, because many colleges are really, particularly when yield goes down, really have to figure out how are we going to, to get students who may be interested in us to get to, to get to them early, and to get them something that may really, seal the deal for them.
Yeah.
And frankly, on-the-spot admission and things like that, I think are the future of many institutions, because right now you have the for-profit sector doing on-the-spot admission to the great detriment of a lot of students. But many of our members go into inner city areas and urban areas to sort of do what I was saying earlier, which is to explore places where they've really never been, and get rid of the whole sort of laborious process of applying, which depending on your criteria really don't have to be in place, and just say, listen, based on what we see, you're eligible, and if you want to come here, we'd be glad to have you. So I mean that to me is I think has real potential in the future, and has it now.
Great. Great points, and we're going to keep moving. So chapter 4, we're looking at factors in the admissions decision, and this is always interesting to me. I think we see a lot of the same year after year, and some things that are shifting, maybe just because of changes in our culture. But in this area, we're looking at the factors that colleges are actually using to make their decisions. Are they looking at grades? Are they looking at SAT scores anymore? Are they looking at class rank anymore? And while some things are increasing, some things are decreasing in importance. But this is, again, a chance to look at the admission side of the table and, what's actually happening in those committee rooms, which is helpful if you're only at one institution or if you're an outsider looking in. Interesting to me was a kind of shining moment that we're seeing more qualified students in the applicant pool. There's a stat in there from 1990 to 2009, students completing additional credits during their high school career. So it gives me a little glimmer of hope in our K-12 system that students are getting a little bit more out of that high school curriculum.
With a couple of exceptions, class rank down, demonstrated interest up, and a few minor trends. We actually made a mistake and said that testing was up in the last decade. It's actually down in the last decade, up over the last 20 years.
Oh, okay.
So choose your timeline, but generally that's kind of the most often cited part of the report, and stuff that parents and families frankly need to hear, because a lot of people think it's tests or some other, some maybe rank or something like that, but clearly very useful information.
Absolutely, yeah. And looking at, I expected to see more about that SAT, ACT, as we've seen a lot of schools move test optional recently, and schools doing their own research on whether or not that test piece is the most critical part of the puzzle or not. So we'll keep looking on at that as those trends continue. The last couple chapters I'm going to lump together. They cover school counselors and college counseling and the admissions office. And what I gathered from those chapters is that both on the high school side and on the college side, counseling offices are being asked to do more with less. I unfortunately got a paycheck today and think that is continuing this year. I don't think that's a surprise, but can we take away that offices might be reaching out to more community-based organizations or third-party vendors that support higher ed to kind of offset this big need that we have?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is clearly both high schools and colleges are increasingly looking to new and different resources to try to expand their reach. Obviously, the professionals involved are in control of the situation, but they're having to reach out to others to help them do the work that they used to do.
Right. Well, that was kind of our again, our bird's eye view at the report itself, and I've picked a few topics to kind of take a deeper dive into. We're also going to be ready to field any questions that you have. So if you're tuning in live over Twitter, thank you for hanging on during our little technical blip there. And I'll be watching the Admissions Live hashtag if you want to send any questions our way for David. So David, let's take a deeper dive into the demographics piece of the report. And specifically, I want to look at diversity. Not just because it's, always a big highlighted piece in the report, but this year, diversity made a really big splash, I think, in our industry with Fisher v. University of Texas. So what did you see over this past year, being in Washington during all of that? What was the reaction from your peer group, and how do you think that is going to continue to play a role for us in the admissions office?
Well, I think if I had to pick a word to describe the response so far, I think there's a certain amount of resignation. I don't think anyone here is any less passionate about supporting a college's right to consider factors in the admission process that are going to get them the class that they want and the class that the institution needs to have to fulfill its mission, which mission statements are quite diverse, but many of them have diversity as a core component of them. But to have the Supreme Court take a case so soon after they just ruled in 2003 on the past case, and then prior to that had not ruled since 1978, made, I think, many of us feel like there weren't many prospects for this coming out in a more generous fashion than the previous case. So I think there is some, that when I say resignation, I think there is some element of preparing ourselves to think that perhaps this could be a moment where the court either further narrows or completely shuts off a college's ability to consider race in admission. I hope it doesn't go that far, the second option there, but I think the reality for admission officers is that they're going to have fewer and fewer circumstances under which they can consider race and ethnicity, which is a real, I think, sort of a, it's unfortunate to say the least, because there are so many things that happen before a student ever applies to college that helps to cause this imbalance. So I do think we're going to be having to do, more with less in this area, and that again, I go back to the personal connections between colleges and their feeder networks as being critically important.
Yep, I understand that completely. The next piece that was, I think, thrilling, I'm going to use the word, I was thrilled to see high school visits highlighted in the report. I've been an admissions road warrior for 6 years, and part of my role is being in high schools to meet with students. But there's an excerpt in the report from a high school student. It's a note to the admissions counselor that she missed her opportunity to meet with the counselor because X, Y, and Z reason she was too busy during the day. So I want you to talk a little bit about that because it's something that I think the young professionals who are out on the road struggle with, and the enrollment division sees as a good solid practice because it's been done for so many years. So what is this what do you think the stance should be on these kinds of practices, or when we should deem something a good practice or not? I think it's a challenge for, again, those young professionals who are out doing the work and doing the same thing without results each year.
Yeah, well, just maybe a few points briefly. The first is a history lesson. I mean, for those of you who haven't studied admission in depth in an academic setting, one of the first ways in which colleges started to reach out to high schools systematically was in the Midwest. University of Michigan and University of Wisconsin led the way in this regard. They used to accredit high schools, or they used to certify high schools, and they would actually go to the school and evaluate their academic curriculum. And if once they certified the high school, they would take any graduate because they knew that they had completed a good course of study that the university had reviewed and approved of. So in this sense, you who are visiting high schools are in some ways the last vestige of that very hands-on approach to getting to know a high school. Now, the original certification process turned into what we see today as the transcript, and that's how that kind of came into being. And of course, we have other ways now of evaluating students on a larger scale. But the idea that a college has a very personal connection to a high school is something that I think is very important, and the research has even borne it out. We've seen a number of studies that show the value of relationships between high schools and colleges, and we all know in NACAC that it's much easier to pick up the phone if you've actually met the person, and much easier to have that exchange to the benefit of the students than if you're cold calling. So that's critically important. The second thing that's important to know for admission officers is to not get discouraged. I mean, I think in the excerpt that we put into this report and in the full journal article that it was taken from, the admission officer, Angel Perez at Pitzer College, was at first discouraged when he walked into a high school where the counselor was sort of AWOL, or that that he found himself stuck in a corner in the cafeteria while the kids ate lunch, which is like awful. But you get food thrown at you probably. But there are good ways and bad ways for high schools to host admission officers. But generally speaking, counselors, and this would be my third point, counselors trust representatives of colleges to give them, more than anyone, to give them information about college. So, you have to know walking in you're an authority. Secondly, a lot of counselors don't get training in college counseling. So you may be one of the few people that students talk to, and counselors, who know a lot about admission and financial aid. So those three factors combined, I think, would point to the high school visits as continuing to be a very important part of our strategies in recruitment, even with all of the social networking and technology that we have, which is vitally important. It's such a great supplement, though, to the high school visit, because once you plug into the students, they know how to get you after that.
Yeah, I have to agree. And again, reflecting on my own experience, I think it took about 3 years. Halfway through, I had figured this whole high school travel thing. And it's not something easy to grasp, even if you're only traveling to one small area. But the repetition and the familiarity and understanding the nuances of the different towns and schools and the populations that you're working with does really help, and it makes those visits much easier and more rewarding the more you do it. So for those of you just getting started, just keep going. The next thing that actually I do want to take a question from Twitter. One came in from John Lawler, and his question is, what are economic characteristics of early action or early decision applicants? And he's also curious about the yield rates as far as matriculating for those students. So do you have any insight as to a difference in the economic characteristics of those students?
The economic characteristics, not as much. We don't collect data directly on that subject. Now, the only research I've seen, it really dates back to 2003-04 when some scholars did work with a selection of institutions that had early decision, and certainly the data that they produced reinforced the conventional wisdom that the early decision pool tends to be much more socioeconomically well off than the regular pool. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't know of any comprehensive studies. I don't know of any comprehensive studies on early action and socioeconomic characteristics. We do in our admission report, in our state of college admission report, have data about yield rates under early action and early decision. I'm going to try to flip through here very quickly to see if I can locate them. Now, early decision, obviously the yield rate is pretty high because you're bound to attend. But even having said that, we've noticed a slight decline. I mean, earlier in the decade, we were looking at the low to mid 90s for your average yield rate, which meant that some people were backing out. But with the most recent year's report, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to put my eyes on it right this minute, the yield rate has dipped into the upper 80s, which is kind of interesting. That's kind of a significant chunk of your early decision class, bailing ship on you. But I guess, the fact that you can get 80-90% of the students in is still helpful. So right. Now early action, we've seen yield rates that look a lot more like regular decision. Okay. In fact, some years we've seen early action yield rates that have been below regular admission. And so we always kind of wonder, we've never actually gone into this in great depth, but we kind of wonder sometimes why colleges use it. And we hear from colleges that generally, just stretching out the process, getting some early applicants in, or getting some sense that you're going to have, at least a chunk of your, you can count on 20-30%, is helpful. So, I mean, that's probably the extent of what we know in terms of the yield and the socioeconomic.
Great. Well, those are good insights for me. I haven't been part of an early action plan before, so I guess I'm glad to hear that it's not something that I'm missing out on necessarily. And I did have one point that I was looking at along the same lines of ED and not just the decisions, but the deadlines that seem to be moving up. The early notification and accelerated admission practices. And I've felt the feedback from counselors, and I'm wondering if it's reflected the same in the report, that the move towards these early processes is really putting a stress on the process itself and the students and families that are trying to complete these things, sometimes even over the summer when they don't have access to counseling. So is that similar to what you found in your report?
Yeah, and really the last time we looked at that in depth was a few years ago when NACAC was wrestling with that very question, whether the sort of what we call the acceleration of the admission process was starting to maybe erode the confidence in the process itself and among students and counselors. And basically NACAC has a requirement that you have to have at least a final junior year transcript before you can start sending out admission letters. We did find, in fact, that counselors, many of whom were not in during the summer, suggested that the increased work volume would put a pinch on them. And I do think it's something that's important to keep our eyes on. Now, having said that, we haven't seen as much recently. I'd say that concern peaked around 2008, 2009 maybe, and since we've put that measure in, it really has subsided quite a bit. So I think. But you're exactly right that you need to make sure that we're giving students time to finish high school, and we're keeping our counselor colleagues in mind.
Great. One thing I did want to touch on because we mentioned it earlier, and then we're going to have to start thinking about wrapping things up. But it was the piece about financial aid counseling, and in the report there's an excerpt about giving advice on student loans. These kinds of conversations are never the most comfortable conversations to have with students and families, both on the counselors and, although I've become more comfortable with it now, I think it's an uncomfortable conversation for the family to have with a stranger as well. So what findings are in the report that can help us understand what we should be doing as admissions counselors in this financial aid counseling role? Is there anything that kind of we'd be stepping over bounds and that should be handed off to a trained financial aid counselor? Is that line blurring more? What are you finding there?
Yeah, no, that study we did showed us very clearly that high school counselors need a lot of help. Both they need the information and education that goes with financial aid training, and they just are over powered, or they're not able to keep up with the number of students they have to counsel. So I think it's absolutely an important part of an admission officer's job to talk about financial aid. Now, I think the extent of it is the sort of general counseling that you all do when you're on the road and talk, and that is a very important service that you provide to students and to secondary schools as well. And they trust you, as I said earlier. They trust you for good information, so that's a good thing. Obviously, when parents start asking specific questions about their dollars and cents, the financial aid office is probably the place to send them. However, one example of how the NACAC research process helps take the voices of members and moves them to where they need to be, which is, in state capitals or in Washington. After this report was issued, we advocated very strongly for some new provisions that have been enacted, like the income-based repayment plan here at the Department of Education, which allows students to pay pay only a specific percentage of what they make after college if they go into a job that's not as high paying as, say, lawyer, doctor, whatever. So in some ways, the policies we've advocated for have now helped, I think, counselors and admission officers talk, or at least assure families that there are ways in which they can manage debt after college. And ways that they can even predict how much that they're going to have to take before they go, again, thanks to some of these new policies that have been put into place. So I think educating, for admission officers, educating yourself about some of the newest features from the Department of Education about student loans and borrowing would be a great way to help out counselors and families.
Great. One last thing from me, and then if there's anything, well, I'll ask you after this last point. The last thing that I think others will also find interesting in the report is the piece about college rankings, because I think you took a little bit deeper of a dive, or at least it was highlighted more for me in this report, on kind of what the state of the college ranking situation is, looking at peer assessments versus just hard data. And so at the end of the day, are your thoughts on college rankings, are they helpful or are they hurting us, or is it both? Are they helpful at all?
Let me answer that question by saying rankings in and of themselves are not terribly helpful on balance. Putting things on top of other things, as the Monty Python skit says, is sort of an esoteric enterprise. So, the ranking of colleges is not terribly helpful. Now, some of the data that they provide, some of the guidance that the rankings publications provide might be helpful, in fact, because they do put a lot of data out there that students can use to make their own decisions. But ultimately, I think the fact that the rankings do perpetuate this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of the rank-ordered, distinctions between colleges, which really, for the top 50 to 75 colleges, are pretty meaningless statistically. I do think that they've done a lot to sort of confuse people's perceptions about colleges. So ultimately, again, this is where our voice comes through and suggests, really it's about the connection that you make to the college and the amount of work that you do to put into it. And meanwhile, I would just add, finally, on this topic, that we have a love-hate relationship with the rankings. We love to hate them, and we regret that we also love them, and that they're on banners all over our campuses and in our mailers and in our alumni publications, and I could go on and on. So. We'll continue to stay on top of that and see what we can do to maybe mitigate some of the problems out there.
Well, I appreciate your point about them providing good data, and that is important for people to be able to look at some of those data points side by side. So I do appreciate that. And this is my very last question to you, and then we're going to call it a night. This report, putting it in the hands of admissions professionals, school counselors, what is your hope that we will take away from this report as professionals? If you could drop this on every one of our desks, what would you want us to do with it?
Two things, I'll tell you right up front. The first thing is that I hope it gives you some professional information that will be helpful to you in your career, if not your day-to-day job. That if you are thinking of making admission a profession for life, that this would be valuable information for you to simply have under your belt. So I hope that that's one benefit. The second benefit is the one where you're standing in a room full of students and families, and there's a mob mentality about one subject or another. My hope is that issues in this book, or in this report, would enable you to sort of calm the hysteria a little bit. When people start talking about standardized testing or about eliminating class rank at their school is going to hurt their students in the admission process. I think that this report can suggest, well, there's a lot here, and you need to think a little bit more about it before you get too panicked. So I think those two things would probably be the two biggest deliverables.
Great. And they have been for me. So David, I want to thank you again for coming on Admissions Live. I hope we can continue to make this an annual report to our profession, both on paper and on Admissions Live. So thank you again for coming on, and for everyone who tuned in tonight. And you can find this again on Tuesday nights on higheredlive.com.